The pounding on the door came so violently that the old picture frames rattled on the wall. "Open this door, Clara, you senile old woman!" Vanessa's voice sliced through the quiet morning. Each bang echoed down the hallway like thunder. Clara sat frozen in her recliner, her teacup trembling slightly in her hand. This was her house paid for with 40 years of work, but the woman screaming outside acted as if she were the owner. "You think you can lock us out? We live here now." Vanessa's words stabbed deep. Clara's lips pressed together. Her gaze drifted to the crooked wedding photo on the wall, the one Vanessa had ordered her to take down last week because it clashed with the new decor. The irony almost made her laugh. Somewhere upstairs, her son Marcus was silent just as he always was. And in that silence, something inside Clara began to shift. It was the sound that would change everything, the sound of her daughter-in-law pounding on the door of a home that was never hers. The yelling faded, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old clock. Clara exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of another morning start again. She rose from the recliner and moved carefully toward the kitchen. Her knees ached from years of work, but she still managed to move quietly out of habit. Vanessa hated noise. "You stomp like an elephant," she'd once said. So Clara learned to glide, to breathe softly, to make herself smaller. By the time Marcus came down, coffee was already brewing, toast was laid out, eggs sizzling in the pan. Vanessa appeared moments later, scrolling on her phone. "Why is the toast cold again?" she asked flatly. Clara turned, forcing a polite smile. "I'll make a new batch." Vanessa sighed, muttering something under her breath about old people forgetting things. Marcus took his seat reading emails on his tablet, pretending not to hear. Clara placed the fresh toast on the table and stood back. Not a thank you, not even eye contact, just silence, the kind that hums louder than any insult. After breakfast, Vanessa handed her a list written neatly in pink ink. "Laundry, bathrooms, vacuum upstairs. Don't forget the guest room, I have clients coming by tonight." Clara nodded, folding the note. "Yes, dear." Vanessa smiled faintly. "Good. Oh, and please stay out of sight when they're here. You make things awkward." That one word, awkward, echoed in her chest like a bruise. She had become invisible in her own home. When the chores were done, Clara slipped into the storage room, her so-called bedroom. It used to hold tools and boxes, but now it held her life. The small bed barely fit between the shelves. A single bulb flickered overhead. She sat on the edge, listening to the footsteps above her, the laughter of her son and his wife, the life she used to lead, now taking place somewhere she no longer belonged. On the wall hung one photo she refused to hide: Harold, her late husband, smiling in his Sunday suit. "You wouldn't believe how they treat your wife now," she whispered to the picture. Her voice cracked. "I did everything right. I thought keeping family close meant safety." The bulb buzzed softly in reply. That evening, the smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. Clara had cooked Marcus's favorite dish, hoping maybe he'd notice. When she carried the platter to the table, Vanessa's friends were already there, 3 young women in sharp blazers, laughing, drinking wine. "Oh, is this your cook?" one asked. Vanessa smirked. "Something like that. She helps around the house." The words hit Clara harder than any slap. She stood there holding the platter, unsure where to put it. "Just leave it, Clara," Vanessa said quickly. "We've got it from here." The laughter resumed. Clara stepped back, retreating toward the kitchen, the sound of her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She ate alone, later standing by the counter, picking at cold chicken while their voices drifted from the dining room. "You're lucky to have the space for her," one woman said. Vanessa replied, "Luck, try patience. She forgets things, complains about the noise, but Marcus insists we keep her here. I swear some days I feel like I'm running a nursing home." More laughter. Clara bit her lip until she tasted blood. She looked toward the hallway mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back, gray hair pulled tight, shoulders, stooped eyes dulled by exhaustion. When the guests left, Vanessa swept into the kitchen, heels clicking. "Make sure you wash the dishes before bed," she said, not even looking at Clara. "The sink smells." Then she added with a chuckle, "You should thank me, you know. I'm giving you purpose." Clara turned away so Vanessa wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. "Yes, dear," she murmured. Her voice sounded like someone else's. Past midnight, Clara crept downstairs to her room, careful not to make the steps creak. The air smelled of detergent and damp concrete. She pulled the thin blanket over her knees and stared at the ceiling. The laughter from upstairs had faded, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whir of the ceiling fan. She closed her eyes, but the words wouldn't stop replaying. She helps around the house. Nursing home. Useless. At dawn, she woke to pain in her knees and back. She shuffled to the kitchen to prepare breakfast again. Through the window, she saw the mailbox stuffed with envelopes, bills, all in her name. She had paid every one of them since Harold died. Yet in this house, she was the guest. Marcus entered tying his tie. "Morning, Mom." She smiled faintly. "Good morning, sweetheart." He poured coffee without looking at her. "Vanessa wants to repaint the living room. She thinks the color's too old-fashioned." "You're okay with that, right?" Clara swallowed. "If it makes her happy." He nodded, relieved, and left. Not a single word about her health, her meals, her room. Nothing. She leaned against the counter staring at her hands. They were trembling slightly, veins like blue rivers under thin skin. These hands had built everything, paid the mortgage, raised him, held him when he was sick. And now they wiped counters and carried trays for people who treated her like a stranger. She looked around the kitchen, her kitchen, and felt like an intruder. That night Marcus and Vanessa watched a movie upstairs. She could hear them laughing through the vents. Clara sat in her small room again, the smell of bleach heavy in the air. She opened her old Bible, the one with Harold's handwriting in the margins, but couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept circling one thought: how did I end up here? She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart steady, slow, still beating despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on it. When the laughter upstairs grew louder, she reached for the little notebook she kept beside her bed. The pages were mostly blank, just shopping lists and reminders, but that night she wrote something new. "Tomorrow, I'll do something different. I don't know what yet, but something has to change." She closed the notebook, blew out the candle, and lay back. Above her footsteps crossed the ceiling. She listened, not with fear this time, but with a quiet, growing resolve. Her last thought before sleep was a whisper to the darkness: "They think I've forgotten who I am. But they're wrong." And for the first time in a long time, the ache in her chest felt like a spark, instead of a wound. The alarm clock blinked 5:02 a.m. when Clara opened her eyes. The house was still asleep, wrapped in silence except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She moved slowly, her joints stiff, and slipped on her worn slippers. Downstairs, she brewed coffee in the same old pot she'd used for 30 years. The scent filled the kitchen, comforting and lonely all at once. She took her cup in both hands, inhaled the steam, and began the quiet ritual that had become her life. By the time the clock struck 6, the table was already set. Toast stacked neatly, bacon-crisped eggs, soft the way Marcus liked them. She placed the plates carefully so nothing clattered. Vanessa hated noise. When Clara turned, she saw her daughter-in-law standing in the doorway, hair perfectly styled, scrolling through her phone. "You're up early," Clara said gently. "Someone has to keep this house running," Vanessa replied without looking up. She sat down and poked her fork into the eggs. "These are cold again." Clara started to apologize, but Vanessa cut her off. "You know what? Never mind. I'll just grab something on the way to work." Marcus came down moments later, tie half knotted, already on a call. "Morning, Mom," he said, eyes on his phone. She smiled automatically. "Morning, sweetheart." He kissed Vanessa's head, not noticing the untouched breakfast. "You going to the gym later?" he asked her. "Of course," Vanessa replied. "Someone has to stay fit while your mom keeps feeding us carbs." She laughed lightly. Marcus chuckled, kissed her again, and the two of them left, leaving Clara standing by the table, hands trembling over plates no one had eaten from. When the door closed, the quiet pressed heavy on her chest. She cleared the table, scraped the eggs into the trash, and washed the dishes. The water was warm and she focused on the small movements of her hands, anything to stop thinking. She dried the plates, stacked them in their place, and glanced at the pink sticky note Vanessa had left by the counter. Laundry. Vacuum. Guest room sheets. And don't forget to clean the upstairs bathroom, it smells. Clara folded the note, slipped it into her apron pocket, and went to work. The storage room smelled faintly of damp wood and detergent. Sunlight barely reached through the small window covered by boxes. She made her bed just a thin mattress on a metal frame and dusted the shelves above it. Her old photo album sat in a plastic bin under the bed. She pulled one out, brushed off the cover, and opened it. There was Marcus, age 5, grinning with missing teeth. Another picture showed Harold on the porch, holding Marcus on his shoulders. Clara smiled faintly. "You see him now, Harold," she whispered. "All grown up and too busy to remember his mother still breathes." Her voice cracked. She shut the album and slid it back under the bed. That afternoon, the sound of laughter drifted from upstairs. Vanessa's friends had arrived. Clara had been told to stay out of sight, but she could hear them clearly from below. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, clutching her hands together when her phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. "Could you please bring up the fruit tray? Quickly, please." She sighed, stood up, and went to the kitchen. The fruit platter gleamed, strawberries and melons perfectly arranged. She carried it upstairs, moving carefully so nothing would spill. The laughter stopped when she entered. Vanessa's friends turned toward her, bright smiles fading into polite indifference. "Oh, is this your housekeeper?" one asked. Vanessa laughed. "Something like that." The women chuckled, and Clara froze, standing in the doorway with the tray in her hands. Vanessa gestured. "You can leave it on the table, Clara." Her name came out, clipped like a word she didn't want to say. Clara placed the tray down, nodded, and left the room without a sound. Back in the kitchen, she washed the cutting board. She could still hear Vanessa's voice above her. "She's sweet, but you know she needs constant supervision. Forgetful. Old-fashioned." The words burned more than any slap could have. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, eyes dull, mouth tight, and didn't recognize herself. "You're not invisible," she whispered, but the empty room swallowed the sound. Dinner that evening was quiet, until Vanessa dropped her fork with a loud clatter. "Marcus, your mother forgot to pay the internet bill again. I couldn't send my report this morning." Clara looked up from her plate. "I paid it last week." "The receipt's on the counter." Vanessa smirked. "Oh, right, the receipts. Maybe you imagined it." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Can we not start?" Vanessa folded her arms. "I'm not starting anything. I'm just saying maybe it's time we handled the finances. She gets confused sometimes." Clara swallowed hard. "I'm not confused." But her voice was small, lost under the clink of utensils. Marcus stood up, muttering something about work calls, and left the table. Vanessa leaned back, smiling without warmth. "You see, this is why I need order in this house." Later, Clara carried her plate to the sink, though she'd barely eaten. Her stomach felt tight, full of words she never said. When she turned off the faucet, the house was silent again. Upstairs, a door slammed. She wiped her hands on a towel, then pressed them flat on the counter. Enough, she thought, though she wasn't sure what that meant yet. The next morning, her body protested every step. Her knees throbbed as she vacuumed the stairs. Halfway through, dizziness hit her like a wave. She grabbed the banister, breathing hard. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, arms crossed. "If you can't handle simple chores, maybe you should think about assisted living," she said coldly. Clara straightened slowly. "I just need a minute." Marcus came out of the bedroom, hair damp from the shower. "She's right, Mom. You shouldn't overexert yourself." Clara looked at him, the boy she'd once nursed through fevers, and saw only indifference. "I'm fine," she said softly. He shrugged. "Then don't complain when you're tired." That night, Clara sat on her bed in the storage room, rubbing her knees. The ache had become a steady throb. She looked around the small space, the boxes stacked high, the mop leaning in the corner, the single bulb flickering above. "This isn't living," she whispered. The sound of laughter from upstairs returned, muffled but cruel. They were watching a movie together, eating popcorn. She imagined them on the couch she'd bought under the roof she'd paid for. Something inside her began to twist and harden. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the old folder where she kept important papers, insurance documents, tax receipts, the deed to the house. She unfolded the deed carefully. Her name, Clara L. Johnson, printed in bold letters. Her fingers traced it like scripture. "My house," she murmured. "Still mine." The thought steadied her. For the first time in months, her heartbeat slowed, not from exhaustion, but clarity. The next day she put on her Sunday dress and went to the library. She searched for property rights for homeowners, taking notes in her small notebook. Every word she read made her feel lighter. There were laws, options, protections. She copied down one phrase in neat cursive: unlawful detainer. Process to reclaim occupancy. It sounded foreign powerful. She underlined it twice. When she got home, Vanessa was waiting in the living room. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I went out," Clara replied evenly. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "You should tell us when you leave." "It's inconsiderate." Clara hung up her coat without answering. Vanessa scoffed. "Whatever. Just don't forget to wash the drapes tomorrow." Clara turned her head slightly, her eyes calm, unreadable. "I have a doctor's appointment," she said. "Then do it after. You don't exactly have a busy schedule." Vanessa smirked and walked away, heels tapping like tiny hammers on the hardwood floor. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint wind outside. Her mind replayed every insult, every order, every time Marcus looked away. But instead of pain, there was now something sharper: resolve. She reached for her notebook and wrote a single sentence on a blank page: "Tomorrow I make a call." Then she set the notebook down, blew out the candle, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt a strange peace in her chest. It wasn't happiness. It was something steadier, deeper. It was purpose. The rain came down in a slow, steady rhythm against the kitchen window. Dinner was ready: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans laid neatly on the table. Clara had set out 3 plates as she always did, though she already knew how the evening would go. The sound of Marcus's car door slamming echoed outside, followed by Vanessa's voice, complaining about traffic. Clara straightened the silverware and forced a smile as they walked in. "Dinner's ready," she said softly. Vanessa brushed past her without a glance. Marcus nodded, eyes still on his phone. They sat. The first few minutes passed in silence, just the clinking of forks. Then Vanessa sighed, loud and deliberate. "Marcus, your mother forgot to pay the internet again. I couldn't upload my campaign this morning." Clara set down her fork. "That's not true," she said quietly. "I paid it on Tuesday. There's a receipt." Vanessa's eyebrows lifted. "Oh, really? Maybe you imagined it. You've been forgetting things lately." Marcus didn't look up. "Let's not argue, okay," he muttered. Clara stared at him, disbelief rising like heat in her chest. "Marcus, you know I handle those bills. You saw me pay it." But he was already pushing his plate away. "I'm tired, Mom. Can we not do this?" His tone carried that familiar edge of annoyance, the same one he used when she asked for help carrying groceries. Something inside her snapped. She placed both hands on the table, palms flat, the sound sharp. "You don't get to talk to me like that in my own house." The words came out before she could stop them. The room froze. Marcus looked up, startled. Vanessa smirked. "Your house? That's funny. We've been paying for everything since you retired." Clara's heartbeat pounded in her ears. "You've been paying for nothing," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Every bill is in my name." Vanessa leaned back, feigning amusement. "Oh, relax. We're all family here. No need to get dramatic." Clara stood slowly, her chair scraping the floor. "You're right. No need to get dramatic." She turned and walked toward the sink, her back straight. Behind her, Vanessa whispered something and Marcus laughed softly. That laugh burned more than the insult. In her room that night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the thunder outside. The small space smelled faintly of bleach and damp wood. She opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out an old photograph: Marcus, at 10, missing a front tooth, grinning proudly with a baseball glove too big for his hand. She traced his face with her finger. "I gave you everything," she whispered. "All I ever wanted was to be treated with kindness." Her throat tightened. For the first time in years she felt something stronger than sadness, anger, clear and cold. The next morning she went through her day like a ghost. She cooked breakfast, folded laundry, scrubbed the bathroom tiles. Each motion was automatic practice numbing. When Vanessa entered the kitchen later, she waved her phone around. "Marcus, your mother forgot to restock the detergent. I can't do laundry." Clara turned from the sink. "There's more under the counter." Vanessa opened the cabinet, found the bottle, and smiled without warmth. "Guess you remembered something today." Clara said nothing. She watched Vanessa leave the room, her laughter floating down the hall. And then softly under her breath she said, "I'm done being your servant." That afternoon Clara found the old box she'd kept in the closet. Inside were photos, bills, and the deed to the house carefully wrapped in plastic. She unfolded it slowly, the paper yellowed at the edges. There it was, her name. Clara L. Johnson, sole owner. She stared at the words for a long time, letting them settle into her bones. "It's mine," she murmured. "It's always been mine." She placed the papers back in the box and slid it under the bed, the seed of an idea forming quietly. 2 days later, Vanessa hosted another gathering. The smell of grilled steak and perfume filled the air. Clara stayed in the kitchen washing dishes, but she could hear everything. "Your mother-in-law seems nice," someone said upstairs. Vanessa laughed. "Nice, please. She's exhausting. Marcus and I are basically her caretakers. Honestly, it's like having a teenager who forgets everything." Laughter followed. Clara stood still, her hands submerged in soapy water, her reflection wavering on the surface. She took a deep breath, set the dish aside, and walked toward the stairs. But halfway up she stopped. The anger burned, but she forced herself to turn back. Not tonight. Not yet. Later that evening, as the guests left, Vanessa appeared in the doorway. "Make sure you clean up before you go to bed," she said. "And don't forget the wine stains on the rug." Clara looked at her calmly. "No problem." Vanessa hesitated, thrown off by the evenness in her voice, then walked away. At midnight, Clara sat by the small window in her room, rain dripping from the eaves. Her reflection in the glass was pale, but her eyes were sharp. "Enough," she whispered. "They think I'm weak because I stay quiet. They're about to learn silence isn't weakness." She reached for her notebook and wrote a single line. Step 1, find a lawyer. The next morning she dressed neatly, gray slacks, navy cardigan, and left the house early. The air smelled of wet asphalt and magnolia blooms. She stopped by a small cafe near downtown and ordered a black coffee. Her hand still trembled slightly as she pulled a worn business card from her wallet. Langford and Associates, Estate and Family Law. The name stirred a memory. Harold had used them decades ago when they bought the house. She dialed the number. The receptionist answered cheerfully. "Good morning, Langford and Associates." Clara's throat felt dry. "Hello," she said slowly. "My name is Clara Johnson. I need to speak with Mr. Langford about my property." The receptionist paused. "Is this an urgent matter?" Clara glanced out the window at the gray clouds. "Yes," she said. "It's about reclaiming my home." She met Mr. Langford the next day. The office smelled of old wood and paper. The lawyer, a man in his 60s, with kind eyes, looked up from behind his desk. "Mrs. Johnson, it's been a long time." Clara nodded. "You helped my husband Harold buy our home in '92. Langford smiled. "I remember. Lovely couple." His smile faded when he saw her face. "Tell me what's going on." She told him everything, the storage room, the insults, the silence of her son. Langford listened quietly, hands folded. When she finished, he leaned back. "You still have the deed?" "Yes," she said. "In my name?" He nodded. "Then you have every legal right to remove them. You're the sole owner." Her heart skipped. "Remove them," how he explained, slowly, carefully, the eviction process, the documentation she'd need, the proof of ownership. "It will take time," he said. "But we'll do it right. No shouting, no chaos, just law." Clara left the office feeling lighter than she had in years. The city noise seemed distant, muffled under the steady beat of her heart. She walked to the bus stop, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles. For once, she didn't mind the rain. Every drop felt like a drumbeat to her resolve. That evening, back in her room, she opened the notebook again. Under the line, find a lawyer, she added, gather proof. Record everything. She glanced at the ceiling where laughter drifted faintly down from upstairs. Her hand steadied as she wrote the final sentence of the night. They've taken my peace long enough. Tomorrow I start taking it back. The next morning was gray and cool, the kind of morning that made Clara's bones ache but her mind feel clear. She stood at the bus stop with her folder clutched to her chest. The papers inside neatly arranged the deed, the tax receipts, and copies of every bill she'd paid. The bus hissed to a stop. She climbed aboard, found a seat near the window, and watched Atlanta pass by small bakeries, churches, the same streets she'd walked for decades. Her heart was steady not from calm but from determination. The office of Langford and Associates sat on a quiet corner downtown, a modest building with an old brass plaque by the door. Inside smelled of paper coffee and faint lemon polish. The receptionist led her to Mr. Sender, Langford's office, where the lawyer stood, waiting, gray hair, slicked back spectacles perched low on his nose. Mrs. Johnson, he said, warmly extending his hand. It's good to see you again. She smiled faintly. Good to see you too, though. I wish it were under better circumstances. He gestured for her to sit. Let's start from the beginning. She told him everything. Vanessa's commands, Marcus's silence, the storage room, the humiliation. Langford listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then. When she finished, he tapped his pen lightly against his desk. You own the property outright, correct? She slid the deed toward him. Yes. Harold and I paid it off in 2004. My name's the only one on it. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the document. Then legally, they have no right to occupy it without your consent. You can begin what's called an unlawful detainer process. She frowned. That sounds harsh. He smiled kindly. It's not revenge, Mrs. Johnson. It's justice. You're not evicting family, you're protecting yourself. She nodded slowly, letting the words settle. Justice, she repeated. Not revenge. He gave her a list of steps, written neatly in blue ink. Document everything. Keep records of every expense. Record any abusive interaction, but discreetly. We'll build a timeline and establish emotional and physical mistreatment. He leaned forward. The law needs proof, not pain. Clara met his eyes. I can do that. He smiled, the kind of small, proud smile of a man who'd seen too many women broken by silence. Then, let's get started. That afternoon, Clara went to a small electronics store near the bus stop and bought a cheap digital recorder. It's for an oral history project, she told the clerk when he asked. He nodded, uninterested. She placed the recorder deep in her apron pocket and wrote home the plan already forming in her mind. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid to walk through her own front door. Vanessa was in the living room when she came in, shoes kicked off, laptop open on her knees. Where were you? She asked, eyes narrow. Clara smiled mildly. Just out for errands. You should tell me when you leave, Vanessa said. I need to know who's in the house. Security reasons. Of course, Clara replied. You run everything so well. Vanessa blinked, unsure if that was sarcasm. Clara went to the kitchen before the younger woman could answer. She turned on the sink and pressed the small button on her recorder. The red light blinked once, then disappeared inside the pocket seam. The next few days became a quiet mission. She carried the recorder everywhere. When Vanessa snapped at her for taking too long with the laundry, recorded. When Marcus dismissed her questions about money, recorded. When Vanessa said, "You're lucky we let you stay here, you know," that recorded. She labeled each file on her old laptop, careful and precise. June 12. Insult in kitchen. June 13. Ignored request for help. June 15. Argument about bills. Each time she played them back, her hands shook, but not from fear anymore. From focus. At night, she sat at her small desk, listening to the clips through headphones. The voices of her son and his wife filled the little room. She's losing it, Marcus said in one. Mom can't handle living alone. We're doing her a favor. Vanessa's voice followed, sharp and cold. A favor, she's dead weight. She should be grateful she's not in a facility. Clara paused the playback, her reflection staring back at her from the dark laptop screen. A facility, she whispered. They'd already buried me in their minds. She clicked save, added the file to the growing folder marked evidence. One afternoon, she met Langford again to show him the progress. He opened each file, listening through small earphones. His jaw tightened with every insult. When the last recording finished, he removed the earphones and set them down carefully. This, he said quietly, is emotional abuse. And it's admissible evidence. Clara nodded. I don't want to ruin them, Mr. Langford. I just want them gone. You're not ruining anyone, he said gently. They did that themselves. You're reclaiming your house and your dignity. The word dignity hit her harder than any legal term. That night, Clara sat in her room with her cup of tea, staring at the folder of papers spread on her bed. For years, she had collected receipts, paid taxes, kept the electricity on, while Marcus and Vanessa lived rent-free. Every bill was a testament to her endurance. She organized them by date, clipped them together, and slipped them into a large envelope labeled Proof of Ownership. She smiled to herself. Harold would be proud, she murmured. You always said keep the papers safe. Vanessa nearly discovered the recordings once. Clara was cleaning the living room when her apron slipped off the chair and the small recorder clattered onto the floor. Vanessa glanced up from her laptop. What's that? Clara's pulse spiked. Oh, just a grocery list thing, she said quickly, bending down. It helps me remember what to buy. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, shrugged, and went back to typing. Clara carried the recorder to her room that night and hid it inside a teapot on her shelf. You won't catch me slipping again, she whispered. A week later, Clara visited Langford with a USB drive. Everything's copied and backed up, she said, handing it to him. He nodded approvingly. Smart. Never keep all the proof in one place. He slipped it into his drawer. You've done beautifully, Clara. When the time comes, the court will see what's really been happening. She exhaled slowly. When the time comes, she repeated. The phrase felt like both a warning and a promise. Back home, she began noticing small things she hadn't before. The sound of her own footsteps echoing in the hallway. The creak of the old stair railing Harold had built himself. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder, more certain, as if reminding her that time was finally on her side. She polished the family photos and hung one of her and Harold back in the hallway. When Vanessa came home that evening, her eyes narrowed. Did you put that up? Yes, Clara said simply. It belongs here. Vanessa opened her mouth, but something in Clara's calm stare stopped her. For once, Vanessa said nothing. The next morning, Clara stepped outside to water the small row of marigolds along the porch. Mrs. Green, the neighbor, waved from her driveway. Morning, Clara. Haven't seen you smile like that in a while. Clara chuckled softly. Feels good to breathe again. Mrs. Green tilted her head. You doing okay in there, I hear? Well, you know how sound carries. Clara hesitated, then said, I'm managing. But, thank you for asking. The older woman nodded. If you ever need a witness to anything, you just call me. I see more than people think. Clara's eyes softened. I'll remember that, Mrs. Green. It wasn't a coincidence. It felt like the world was quietly lining up behind her. That evening, as dusk settled, Clara brewed tea and opened her notebook again. She flipped to the first page where she had written, Step 1, find a lawyer. Underneath, she added a new line, Step 2, gather proof. Step 3, wait for the right day. She set the pen down and looked around the little room that had once felt like a cell. Tonight it felt different, like a war room, small but sacred. Above her, Vanessa's voice carried faintly through the vents, laughing about something meaningless. Clara smiled to herself, calm and deliberate. Laugh while you can, she murmured. The locks are next. The words sounded strange in her mouth, steady, sure, not a threat, but a plan. She took a deep breath, closed the notebook, and turned off the light. The darkness didn't scare her anymore. It felt like cover protection for the storm she was quietly building. And as she drifted to sleep, one thought followed her into the dark: they'll never see it coming. The morning sun slipped through the blinds, slicing pale gold lines across Clara's kitchen counter. The clock read 6:47 a.m. She had been up since 5, unable to sleep. The folder of documents sat on the table, a silent witness to what she was about to do. Her heart beat fast but steady. Today, she whispered, tightening her shawl around her shoulders, I start taking it back. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs in silk pajamas, scrolling on her phone. Why are you up so early again? She muttered. I thought retired people were supposed to rest. Clara turned from the stove, her voice calm. I rest when the work is done. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Then, you must be immortal, because it's never done with you. She grabbed a mug and poured coffee, ignoring Clara completely. When Marcus came down, he looked tired, distracted. Morning, he said, grabbing toast. Vanessa, you ready for the meeting? She nodded, checking her reflection in the microwave door. Of course. I just hope your mother doesn't rearrange the house while we're gone. Clara froze for a moment, then smiled faintly. Don't worry, dear. I'm done rearranging anything. By the time their car disappeared down the street, the silence felt different, thick, alive. Clara walked slowly to the hall closet, pulled out a small metal box and opened it. Inside were 3 new locks, heavy brass ones with reinforced deadbolts. She had bought them 2 days earlier, paid in cash. The locksmith had looked at her strangely when she asked for the strongest ones you've got, but she had simply smiled. Now she set them neatly on the table beside her screwdriver. She started with the back door. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, echoing like a heartbeat. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she kept going, unscrewing, replacing, tightening. The first lock clicked into place, then the second, then the front door. When she was done, she stood back, chest rising and falling. Her hands shook, but not from fear. From release. For the first time in years, this house felt like hers again. Around noon, she sat at the kitchen table with tea, staring at the sunlight on the floorboards. Every creak of the house sounded like applause. Harold, she whispered to the empty room, you'd laugh if you saw me now. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from her lawyer, documentation received. Next step, file the motion. Stay firm, Mrs. Johnson. At 5:12 p.m., the quiet ended. Tires screeched in the driveway. Vanessa's voice cut through the air. Why the hell is my key not working? Marcus tried. Next. It's jammed, the handle rattled violently. Clara stayed seated, cup in hand. Clara, Vanessa shouted. Open this door right now. The pounding started again, louder this time, like thunder against wood. Clara walked calmly to the foyer. You changed the locks. Marcus's voice was sharp, disbelieving. She spoke through the door. Yes. Silence. Then, Vanessa's furious shriek, you can't do that. We live here. Clara's tone stayed even. No you don't. Not anymore. You're insane, Vanessa yelled. This is illegal. I'm calling the police. Clara's lips curved into something close to a smile. Do that. I already called them myself. She could hear Marcus cursing under his breath, his tone caught between outrage and uncertainty. Mom, stop this. Don't make it worse. Clara took a deep breath. Marcus, I spent 2 years living in that storage room while you two treated me like I didn't exist. This is not worse. This is justice. The words hung in the air. Vanessa shouted again, but Clara didn't answer. She went back to her chair, heart pounding but steady. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm. 10 minutes later, the sound of another car approached. The police. 2 officers stepped out, one older, one young. Clara opened the door before they could knock. The older officer nodded politely. Ma'am, we received a call about a domestic dispute. Behind him, Marcus and Vanessa stood near the steps, looking disheveled and furious. Clara gestured for the officer to come in. Please come inside. I have the documents ready. She placed the folder on the table. The officer flipped through it. Deed, utility bills, tax receipts, all in her name. This house belongs to you, ma'am. Yes, she said. I bought it in 1992. Paid it off in 2004. No one else's name is on it. He nodded slowly. And they live here without paying rent, correct? The younger officer stepped outside to speak with Marcus and Vanessa. Voices rose and fell. Vanessa was crying now, or pretending to. She locked us out of our home. She's unstable, Marcus added. She's my mother, officer. She's confused. We've been taking care of her. The officer folded his arms. You have proof of residence, lease, rent payments. Marcus hesitated. We don't need one. It's family. The officer's voice stayed calm. That's not how the law works. Inside, the older officer returned to Clara. Legally, ma'am, you're within your rights. They can't force entry. If they wish to contest it, they'll have to do so in court. Clara nodded. Thank you, officer. I have legal counsel ready. He tipped his hat slightly. You did the right thing. When the officers left, Vanessa screamed from the driveway. You'll regret this. Everyone's going to know what you did. Clara closed the door quietly. The click of the lock sounded like music. She stood still for a long time, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a strange calm. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chirp of crickets outside. She walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the curtains. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if the house itself had been holding its breath until now. In the master bedroom, she paused. The bedspread Vanessa had chosen, a glossy white one that looked like it belonged in a hotel, was still there. Clara pulled it off, folded it neatly, and set it aside. From the closet, she took out her old quilt, the one Harold's mother had made, by hand, squares of blue and gold stitched with care. She spread it across the bed, smoothing the wrinkles. The room suddenly looked familiar again. Hers. She opened the window, letting the cool air wash through. The faint smell of lilacs from the garden drifted in. For the first time in 2 years, she could breathe without fear of footsteps stomping upstairs, without someone calling her name like an order. The phone rang again. Marcus. She let it buzz until the voicemail clicked. His voice came through tight with anger. Mom, this isn't over. You think you can just erase us? You're making a huge mistake. She pressed delete without hesitation. Then she brewed another cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights flicker on. A few minutes later, a text appeared. You'll be sorry for this. Another one followed. You'll end up alone. Clara set the phone face down. I've been alone for years, she whispered. This is peace. Outside, the world carried on, cars passing, dogs barking, the hum of distant life. Inside, Clara leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the marigolds outside the window. They looked brighter somehow, standing tall after the rain. She smiled softly. You're still here, she said almost to herself. We're both still standing. That night, she slept in her own bed again. The sheets smelled like sunlight and detergent, not bleach and mold. As she lay under her quilt, the house creaked softly, settling around her. It didn't feel empty. It felt alive, breathing in rhythm with her. Downstairs, the new locks gleamed faintly in the moonlight, silent sentinels guarding her freedom. For the first time in years, Clara fell asleep without fear. And in her dreams, Harold was waiting for her on the porch, smiling the way he used to, the house behind him, glowing warm and safe, as if welcoming her home again. The morning after the lockout, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window like a benediction. Clara stood barefoot on the cool tile, making her first proper breakfast in peace. Bacon sizzled, coffee brewed, and the radio hummed low with a gospel song she hadn't heard in years. She swayed to the rhythm, humming under her breath, her robe brushing lightly against her ankles. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't flinch when the floor creaked or listen for footsteps above. The house belonged to her again, and it sounded different, quieter, kinder. Her phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. She stared for a moment before answering. Mrs. Johnson. The voice was firm, professional. This is Officer Grant from the Atlanta Police Department. Just following up on yesterday's call. Everything all right at the property? Clara smiled faintly. Better than all right, officer. Thank you for your help. He hesitated before responding. Glad to hear it, ma'am. If they show up again, don't hesitate to call. You did everything by the book. After hanging up, Clara poured her coffee and sat at the table. The marigolds outside glowed in the morning light, bright against the trimmed grass. She took a slow sip, savoring the calm. Then she opened her notebook, the one she'd started months ago. At the bottom of the page, she wrote in neat cursive, Step 4. Defend your peace. The quiet lasted less than a day. By evening, the phone began to buzz again, first Marcus, then Vanessa. Text after text, like little knives. You can't just throw family out like garbage. You'll regret this. Everyone's going to know what kind of mother you are. Clara deleted each one, her face unreadable. At 9:17 p.m., Marcus called. She let it ring 5 times before answering. "What do you want?" she said softly. His voice came through sharp, brittle. "We're staying in a hotel." "Do you know how much this costs?" She said nothing. $160 a night. "Mom, you couldn't even give us a few days' notice." Her tone stayed level. "I gave you 2 years. Silence followed. Then Marcus said quietly, "You're not the woman who raised me." Clara's heart pinched, but her voice did not waver. "No," she said. "That woman's been dead a long time. You helped bury her." She hung up before he could answer. That night she sat by the living room window with the lights off, looking out at the streetlights flickering down the block. She half expected them to return to pound on the door again. Instead, the phone glowed with a different message, one that made her pause. "You'll pay for this. We're calling a lawyer." She set the phone down, exhaled, and whispered to the dark, "So will I." The next morning she called Langford. "They're threatening to sue," she said. "Good," he replied. "That means they're desperate. They can try, but they don't have a case." "Should I worry?" she asked. "Not unless words can break a lock," he said dryly. "Just forward anything they send you." She smiled for the first time that day. "Thank you, Mr. Langford." For the next week, the house became a sanctuary. She cleaned, polished, and restored every corner that had once felt tainted. The master bedroom smelled of lavender again. The curtains fluttered softly in the breeze. In the evenings, she played old jazz records Harold used to love, and let the trumpet notes fill the rooms. She began baking again, peach cobbler, cornbread, and sweet potato pie, and shared slices with Mrs. Green, who stopped by every other day with a basket of oranges. "You seem lighter," Mrs. Green said one afternoon, handing her the fruit. "I am," Clara replied. "It's amazing how quiet a house can be when no one's shouting." Mrs. Green chuckled. "That kind of quiet's worth everything." But outside that quiet, the storm was building. 3 days later, Clara's phone exploded with notifications. Her name was trending on Facebook. She frowned and opened one of the links a neighbor had sent her. It was Vanessa sitting in her car, mascara streaked down her cheeks, camera angled perfectly to capture her trembling lips. "My mother-in-law kicked us out with no warning," she said, voice quivering. "We took care of her, paid her bills, treated her like family, and she threw us out like trash." Behind her, Marcus sat stone-faced, silent. "We're homeless," Vanessa continued, her tone trembling. "We have nowhere to go." "Who does that to their own son?" The video had 1,000,000 views in an hour. Clara felt her throat tighten as she scrolled through the comments. "Heartless old woman. People like her don't deserve family. Elder abuse. No, that's just cruelty." She pressed a hand to her chest. Each word stung like a burn. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from numbers she didn't recognize. "Monster. Rot in hell. Wait till your neighbors find out who you really are." For a moment, she considered calling Langford again. Then she took a deep breath and closed the app. "Not yet," she murmured. "Not until they've told every lie they can." By evening, the video had reached 5,000,000 views. Local gossip pages picked it up. "Atlanta woman evicts her son and pregnant daughter-in-law," one headline read. Clara stared at the screen until her vision blurred. "Pregnant," she read the line twice, her stomach twisting. She hadn't known. She turned off the phone and pressed her palms together, breathing slowly. "If it's true," she whispered, "then that poor child doesn't know what kind of mother it's coming to." When night fell, she sat at the kitchen table, the house dark except for one small lamp. She opened her folder of evidence, the recordings, the receipts, the deed, and spread them out neatly. Every insult, every bruise made by words, every moment she'd swallowed her pride, all of it was here. Her proof. Her truth. Then she turned on her recorder one more time and pressed the red button. "This is Clara Johnson," she said softly. And this is my story. Her voice didn't tremble. They can tell the world whatever they want, but the world will know mine too. I have proof. I have truth. And I'm done hiding. She clicked stop and leaned back, her eyes closing. The house hummed quietly around her, the sound of the refrigerator, the creak of old wood, the rhythm of her own breathing. For the first time, she didn't feel powerless against the noise outside. The lies would spread, yes. But the truth had teeth now. The next morning she woke early and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was streaked pink and orange, the city still half asleep. Mrs. Green waved from her driveway. "You okay, Clara?" Clara nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" the neighbor asked. Clara smiled faintly. "About how fast lies travel, and how slow truth walks, but it always gets there." That afternoon she went to the small community library and used one of the public computers. She typed carefully, one key at a time, creating a new account. The name read, Truth by Clara. She uploaded the first recording. Vanessa's voice, sharp and cold. "You're lucky we even let you stay here." Then another clip, Marcus saying Mom's useless now. "She needs to be grateful we keep her around." She paired them with a short caption, "They called me heartless. I'll let you decide." Her finger hovered over the post button for a long moment. Then she clicked. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and promising. Inside, Clara smiled faintly at her reflection in the computer screen. Let's see how they like the truth. That night she sat by the window, the rain falling in soft, steady rhythm. Somewhere across town, Marcus and Vanessa were probably scrolling through their phones, watching the tide of sympathy begin to turn. Clara's tea had gone cold, but she didn't care. She looked up at the ceiling where the shadows flickered with lightning. "You took everything from me," she whispered. "But you forgot I still have a voice." The thunder answered her, rolling long and deep like applause. The first 24 hours after Clara's video went live felt like standing in the middle of a storm. But it wasn't fear that held her this time. It was clarity. She woke to hundreds of notifications, her phone buzzing on the nightstand like a living thing. She rubbed her eyes, slipped on her glasses, and saw the numbers climb 10,000, 20, 50,000 views. The title she'd written in quiet defiance now blazed across screens everywhere, "My side of the story, the truth behind the lies." She pressed play just to be sure it had uploaded correctly. Her own voice came through, calm, steady, almost foreign in its confidence. "My name is Clara Johnson, and this is my home." She had filmed it in the living room, wearing her simple cream cardigan, the deed and police report laid out neatly on the table. She had spoken slowly, carefully, not to convince, but to state facts, not fury. It was the same tone Harold used to take when he wanted the truth to sink deeper than emotion. By mid-morning, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mrs. Green called first. "Clara, you're on the news. Channel 8 just showed your video. I can't believe how calm you were. Half the internet's calling you a hero." Clara smiled faintly, sipping her tea. "A hero? No, just a tired woman who got fed up." Mrs. Green laughed, her voice warm. "Well, whatever you call it, it's working. People are finally seeing what really happened." Across town, Vanessa was spiraling. She sat in her mother's kitchen scrolling through her phone, her face pale. "She recorded us," she hissed. Marcus looked up from the table, stunned. "That can't be legal." "Oh, it's very legal," Brenda said quietly from the stove. "You two played this game too long and now it's turning on you." Vanessa glared at her. "Don't take her side." "I'm not," Brenda replied softly. "I'm just saying you made your bed." Within hours, Clara's calm truth began to erode the carefully built lie. Major outlets started calling. Atlanta Post Online published an article titled, "Elder Woman Speaks Out, Viral Video Reveals Emotional Abuse Behind Family Drama." In the comments, strangers argued passionately. You can hear the daughter-in-law's tone. "That's real." The recordings speak for themselves. Justice for Clara. By sunset, number Justice for Clara trended on Twitter. Someone made a short edit of her saying, "Cruelty is when you make someone feel invisible in their own home," and it spread like wildfire. The internet loved her grace, the calm of a woman who refused to scream. But with fame came backlash. Under the supportive comments, Clara began seeing others cold and vicious. Old people love playing victim. Maybe she edited the recordings. Bet she just wants attention. She scrolled for a few minutes, then stopped. Langford's voice echoed in her mind. Don't fight with ghosts. Let your evidence speak for you. She turned off the phone and went outside. The evening air was cool. Fireflies floated lazily over the marigolds. Across the street, Mrs. Green waved. Don't read the comments, she called. Clara smiled. Too late. But I'm learning. Mrs. Green crossed her arms. You're not just learning, you're teaching. That's what you're doing. Clara looked at her for a long moment and said softly, maybe that's why I survived it, so I could help someone else. The next morning brought a new kind of storm. Vanessa posted her counterattack, a video titled, Lies My Mother-in-Law Told. The tone was raw, angry, desperate. She sat close to the camera, eyes red, hair messy for effect. Those recordings are fake, she cried. She edited them to make me look like a monster. Marcus stood behind her, silent again, his jaw tight. We cared for her, paid her bills, gave her everything, and she kicked us out like dogs, she sobbed. For a few hours the tide seemed to shift. Commenters doubted, questioned, speculated. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Families fight all the time. But then someone uploaded the full, unedited recordings from Clara's shared folder, the one Langford had posted for transparency. Every insult, every word of contempt laid bare. You're useless, Clara, Vanessa's voice rang out clearly. You should thank us for letting you stay. Then Marcus's voice, weary and sharp. Mom, stop being dramatic. You bring this on yourself. The videos were time-stamped, uncut, irrefutable. The pendulum swung back. That evening, Langford called. You've won the court of public opinion, Mrs. Johnson. Now we'll make sure you win the legal one too. She laughed softly, a sound she hadn't made in months. I don't need to win, Mr. Langford. I just don't want to hide anymore. He paused. That's exactly why you already won. News channels aired the story nationwide. CNN ran a short segment titled, Elder Justice When Family Becomes the Abuser. Commentators praised her composure, her evidence, her refusal to shout. A community organization reached out, asking if she'd speak at their event for women over 50 who'd experienced financial or emotional abuse. She agreed, though her hands trembled when she hung up. You're really doing this, she told her reflection. You're turning pain into purpose. Meanwhile, Marcus's phone wouldn't stop ringing either, but for different reasons. His company placed him on administrative leave. Vanessa's employer issued a statement. We are reviewing allegations regarding employee conduct. The two sat together in silence that night, the glow of their phones illuminating faces lined with disbelief. This is your fault, Vanessa spat. Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at his reflection in the dark screen, seeing a man he no longer recognized. By the third day, Clara's video had reached 1 million views. People sent her letters, handwritten digital long paragraphs from strangers. A widow from Ohio wrote, Your story gave me courage to leave my son's house after years of humiliation. Another woman said, I thought I was the only one sleeping in a laundry room. Clara read each one carefully, tears slipping down her cheeks. She hadn't meant to start anything. She just wanted peace. But peace, it seemed, had ripples. That evening, she brewed tea and sat in her armchair by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt like solitude, it felt like freedom. She thought of Harold, of the young woman she once was, of the years spent in silence. They called me bitter, she whispered, to the empty room. But bitterness is what happens when kindness is exhausted. She smiled faintly, and mine has finally rested. Her phone buzzed again, Langford texting. Be prepared. They might file something soon, defamation or emotional damages. Standard tactic. She replied simply, let them. Truth is its own defense. Before bed, she went to the porch. The moonlight lay across the yard, silver and gentle. Somewhere down the block, a child's laughter floated on the wind. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The air smelled like cut grass and something else possibility. Inside, her laptop pinged with a new email notification. Subject line, interview request, the Atlanta Herald. Clara stared at it for a long time. The woman who once couldn't raise her voice above a whisper was now being asked to speak for others. She turned off the light and climbed the stairs slowly, her knees aching, but her spirit light. As she reached the top, she glanced back down the hallway. The old shadows that used to frighten her were gone. Only the warm glow of the living room lamp remained, spilling across the photos on the wall, her and Harold Marcus as a child, smiling wide. She touched the frame gently. Maybe one day, she murmured, you'll remember the man you used to be. Then she went to bed, the soft hum of the world outside carrying her into sleep. This time she didn't dream of shouting or breaking or running. She dreamed of silence, the kind that didn't mean fear but peace. Clara adjusted the small phone stand on her kitchen counter and pressed record. The screen reflected her calm face, framed by the morning light. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, her cream cardigan buttoned to the collar. On the table beside her sat a stack of papers, the deed, the receipts, and a single folder labeled Proof. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadied her heart before the truth. My name is Clara Johnson, she said softly, and I am 66 years old. This is my side of the story. Her voice was even deliberate. 2 weeks ago, my daughter-in-law and my son told the world that I was cruel, that I threw them out with no warning. But this house, the one I worked 40 years to pay off, belongs to me. Every light, every wall, every floorboard paid in full by my labor. And for 2 years I lived in the storage room called a burden in my own home. She lifted the deed toward the camera, holding it steady. This, she said, has my name. No one else's. She placed it down, then reached for her phone. They said I abused them. I will let you hear how they spoke to me. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed play. Vanessa's voice filled the air, sharp, unmistakable. You're lucky we let you stay here, Clara. You should be in a home. Clara didn't flinch. That was my daughter-in-law, she said quietly. And this, she added, pressing play again, is my son. Marcus's voice came next, weary and cruel. Mom, you bring this on yourself. You need to stop acting like a victim. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. That, Clara said softly, is what my home sounded like for 2 years. She leaned forward, eyes steady on the lens. People have called me selfish. But selfishness is expecting someone to disappear just because she's old. I didn't throw anyone out, I reclaimed my life. She turned off the camera and exhaled, her pulse loud in her ears. For a moment, she just sat there, the weight of what she'd done sinking in. Then she nodded once and smiled faintly. That's enough, she whispered. It took less than 2 hours for the video to spread. By noon, it had passed 2,000,000 views. By 3, 500,000. The comments poured in, women, men, strangers from everywhere. You're brave. I believe you. This could be my mom's story. Clara sat at her kitchen table, scrolling slowly through the words, her hands shaking with something between disbelief and gratitude. She wasn't invisible anymore. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa and Marcus sat in their small rented apartment, staring at their phones. Vanessa's face drained of color as the numbers climbed. She posted recordings, she whispered. Marcus rubbed his temples. We can't just let this happen. We have to respond. Vanessa shot him a look, panic in her eyes. How everyone believes her already. That night, Vanessa went live again, her voice trembling with anger. Those clips are fake, she insisted. Edited to make us look bad. She's always been manipulative, but the audience wasn't buying it. The comment section turned ruthless. That's clearly your voice. Stop lying. She's got proof. Vanessa's voice cracked mid-sentence, tears smearing her mascara. The stream cut off abruptly. By dawn, the tide had turned completely. Hashtags flooded every platform, number Justice for Clara, number Elder Voice, number Black Women Stand Tall. News anchors repeated her name with reverence. Atlanta woman defends herself against family abuse and wins the internet's heart. The same neighbors who once whispered gossip now knocked on her door, offering flowers, pie, small notes of support. Even Mrs. Green arrived with tears in her eyes. You did it, she said. You stood up for all of us. Clara smiled softly. I just told the truth. That afternoon the phone rang. It was Langford. Clara, he said, his voice bright for once. Your story's gone national. The public response will help our case immensely. She chuckled. You make it sound like a campaign. It is, he replied. A campaign for justice. When the first journalist called, Clara hesitated. I'm not a celebrity, she said. I just wanted peace. The reporter laughed gently. Sometimes, peace is the most powerful story there is. Later that day, she watched a segment about herself on the news. Her own face filled the television screen, calm and dignified, while the reporter narrated her story. Viewers have rallied behind 66-year-old Clara Johnson, whose quiet strength has inspired thousands across the country to share their experiences of family neglect and emotional abuse. Her throat tightened. She turned the volume down, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh, Harold, she whispered, I never thought speaking up could sound like this. But peace, as always, didn't come without its test. That evening her phone buzzed again. Marcus. Against her better judgment, she answered. Mom, he said, his tone flat but cautious. You've made your point. But you're ruining us. She said nothing. Vanessa lost her job. My boss wants me to take time off. The whole city's talking about us. Are you happy? His voice cracked. You destroyed your own family. She took a deep breath. No, Marcus, she said softly. You destroyed it the day you watched them humiliate me and said nothing. He was silent. I gave you everything I had, she continued. My love, my home, my peace. And you treated me like I was a burden. This isn't revenge, son. It's the truth finally standing up straight. The line went quiet. Then Marcus whispered, You'll die alone. Clara's voice didn't shake. Better alone than surrounded by cruelty. She hung up and set the phone down gently. For the first time his words didn't wound, they simply passed through her like smoke. Outside the evening sky turned violet. A soft breeze drifted through the open window carrying the sound of crickets. She sat by the sill watching the world fade into dusk. The house felt alive again, not haunted by tension but filled with quiet strength. The next morning reporters camped outside her gate. One of them called out as she stepped onto the porch. Mrs. Johnson. What do you want people to learn from your story? She looked straight at them, her voice calm and sure. That silence is not kindness, she said. And that peace is worth fighting for no matter how long it takes. Cameras clicked rapidly but she didn't flinch. She smiled faintly and turned back inside, closing the door behind her. That night she sat by the window again with a cup of tea, the faint glow of her phone lighting her face. The latest headline read, Clara Johnson, the woman who chose dignity. She scrolled through the comments one last time, each word a small echo of validation. Then she closed the app, turned off the phone and whispered, They called me old and useless, now they call me strong. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The marigolds outside swayed in the moonlight. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes glistening. Harold, she said softly, I think I've finally come home. And in that stillness, surrounded by her proof, her peace, and her reclaimed life, Clara understood something deeper than victory. She had turned survival into power, and truth into freedom. The days after Clara's video went viral felt like living in another world. Everywhere she looked, her name appeared on the news ticker in headlines on social media. Strangers were calling her the voice of dignity. Commentators on morning shows debated her case, calling it a modern story of elder justice. She sat in her kitchen with a mug of tea, staring at the television as the anchor said her name. 66-year-old Clara Johnson of Atlanta has sparked a national conversation about emotional abuse and family boundaries. Clara blinked slowly, the words feeling unreal as if they belonged to someone else. Her phone rang non-stop. Some calls were from women thanking her for telling a story they'd never had the courage to share. Others were from reporters or local activists asking her to appear on panels. One message made her pause, a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Green. You did something bigger than you think, Clara. You didn't just save yourself. You gave the rest of us permission to speak. That thought stayed with her all morning. She walked through her house, now bright and quiet sunlight stretching across the polished floors. Every step echoed like confirmation. "This is what freedom sounds like," she murmured. Across town, freedom was the last thing Marcus and Vanessa were feeling. Their apartment was dark, blinds drawn tight. The video of Vanessa's live stream meltdown had already been clipped, shared, and mocked across the internet. Comments piled under every upload. "Liar. You got caught. How's that fake audio now?" Vanessa's cosmetics company had called earlier that morning. They didn't need to fire her publicly, the silence from HR said everything. "They're cutting me off," she told Marcus, her voice shaking. "I built that account for years." Marcus didn't respond. His phone buzzed again, another email from work. This one wasn't subtle. "Administrative leave effective immediately." He threw the phone across the couch. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. Vanessa turned on him, eyes blazing. "No. It's her. She ruined us." "We ruined ourselves," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "She just told the truth." "You're defending her," Vanessa shouted. After everything, he looked up, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "She's my mother, Vanessa." For the first time, the room was silent. Back in her own home, Clara's phone buzzed again. It was Langford. "Good news," he said. "Their lawyer just withdrew the lawsuit. No defamation case, no false eviction claim. They know they can't win." Clara smiled faintly, stirring her tea. "So it's over, legally, yes," Langford said. "But I imagine for them it's just beginning." She thanked him and ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone. It was strange how victory could feel so peaceful. Not sharp or triumphant, just quiet, like the settling of dust after a long storm. That evening, the local news aired another segment about her. This one wasn't dramatic, it was tender. Footage of her smiling in her garden played, while the reporter's voice narrated. Clara Johnson's story has inspired thousands to speak up about mistreatment by family members. Her message is simple: respect has no expiration date. She turned off the TV and leaned back, letting the silence fill the house. The air felt lighter, almost holy. She could breathe again, not carefully or quietly, but fully. The peace lasted until her phone rang. The name on the screen made her heart sink. "Marcus." She hesitated before answering. "What is it, Marcus?" she asked. His voice came through, small, strained. "I just wanted to talk." "About what you've destroyed us," he said, his tone trembling between anger and despair. "We can't go anywhere without people staring. Vanessa can't find work. I lost my job. Everything's gone." Clara's fingers tightened around the phone. "You destroyed yourselves," she said quietly. "I only held up a mirror." There was a pause. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "We were wrong, okay, but this is too much. You didn't have to humiliate us." She closed her eyes. "Humiliation," she repeated softly. "You want to talk about humiliation? Try sleeping in a storage room while your son laughs in the next room. Try eating alone every Christmas while your daughter-in-law tells you that you're lucky she lets you stay. That was humiliation, Marcus. This is justice." He said nothing. The silence on the other end stretched long and heavy until she ended the call. The next morning, Clara woke to a knock at her door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man in a suit. "Langford." "Morning," he said when she opened the door. "I thought I'd deliver the paperwork in person." He set a folder on the kitchen table. "Everything's finalized. You own this house free and clear again with legal affirmation. They can't step foot here without your consent." Clara sat down, the papers spread in front of her. "Thank you," she said softly. "You kept me standing." He shook his head. "You kept yourself standing, Clara. All I did was put it in writing." After he left, she spent the rest of the morning cleaning, humming under her breath. The marigolds outside glowed in the sunlight. She felt no hatred, no bitterness, only stillness. The kind that comes after every storm finds its end. That afternoon she received another call from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Johnson," a woman's voice said. "This is Caroline Pierce from the Atlanta Herald. We'd love to feature your story, but more importantly, your advice for others going through similar situations." Clara hesitated, then replied, "Tell them this kindness doesn't mean silence. And forgiveness doesn't mean you open the door again." That quote ran the next day, printed in bold letters above her photograph. While the world celebrated her as a symbol, Vanessa's world was shrinking. Her followers disappeared. Her sponsorships evaporated. One night she sat in bed scrolling through comments under her old videos, ones that had once been filled with praise and envy. Now every comment was a scar. "Where's your mother-in-law now? You got what you deserved." She turned off the phone and pressed her face into her hands, sobbing. Marcus sat beside her silent. "Say something," she whispered. He looked up at her with hollow eyes. "I think we lost more than jobs," he said quietly. "We lost ourselves." Across town, Clara stood on her porch, a light breeze stirring her hair. The sky was pink with evening. She thought about the past 2 years, about Harold, about the young woman she'd been when she first bought this house. "You'd laugh at all this attention," she whispered to the wind. "You'd tell me I should have spoken up sooner." The phone buzzed again. Another text from Marcus. "Where do you expect us to sleep tonight?" she typed slowly. "Anywhere, but here." Then she set the phone down and went inside, locking the door behind her. Later that night, she sat in her armchair, a soft blanket over her knees, tea steaming on the table. The glow of her laptop illuminated her face as she read messages from strangers who called her brave. But bravery, she thought, wasn't what she felt. It was relief. Freedom. The absence of fear. Outside, crickets sang. The house breathed quietly. For the first time in decades, it felt like a home again, not a place of noise and demands, but of peace. Before she went to bed, she wrote one last line in her notebook. Step 5. Forgive without forgetting. She closed it gently, turned off the lamp, and whispered into the dark, "It's finally over." But as she drifted to sleep, a soft voice in her memory reminded her that every ending has its echo. She didn't know yet that her next knock on the door would not bring anger, but something unexpected, fragile, and human. Something that would test whether her peace was strong enough to survive compassion. The doorbell rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Clara had been pruning her marigolds, the warm sun soft on her back. The sound startled her. It was rare for anyone to visit unannounced. She wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the front door, and peered through the peephole. Her breath caught. Brenda Sterling stood on the porch, neat as always, her posture stiff, her face pale under a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment, Clara considered pretending she wasn't home. But Brenda's eyes lifted, meeting the peephole directly, as if she knew. Clara sighed and unlocked the door, though she didn't open it all the way. "What do you want, Brenda?" she asked, her tone cool. Brenda's voice trembled. "To talk. Please." Clara hesitated, then opened the door wider, motioning her inside. 5 minutes, she said. Brenda nodded gratefully and stepped in, glancing around the house that looked nothing like the one she remembered. "You've redecorated," she murmured. "It feels warmer." Clara crossed her arms. "It feels mine." They stood in awkward silence before Brenda spoke again. "I know I'm the last person you want to see." "You got that right," Clara replied. "But you came anyway, so say what you need to say." Brenda's eyes filled with exhaustion. "Vanessa and Marcus are in bad shape. They're living with me now, just one room, the 3 of us. She can't find work, he barely leaves the bed. They've lost everything." Clara's voice stayed even. "So did I. Difference is, I built myself back up." Brenda swallowed. "I came to ask you to stop the lawsuit." Clara's face didn't change. "What lawsuit?" "The one your lawyer filed for emotional damages." "They can't pay Clara." "You'll destroy them." Clara turned toward the window, her hands resting on the sill. "Destroy them," she said softly. "Brenda, they destroyed themselves. I'm just collecting the debris." Brenda stepped closer. "Please try to understand. Vanessa made mistakes, terrible ones, but she's broken now. She hasn't eaten properly in days. She keeps saying she wishes she could undo it." Clara turned eyes sharp. "Undo it? Did she wish that when she called me useless, when she laughed while I slept next to a mop bucket? Don't talk to me about regret." Brenda's voice cracked. "You're right. I should have stopped her." I should have seen it sooner. Her shoulders sagged. I was proud and maybe jealous. You were everything I wasn't: steady, respected, strong. Vanessa admired you once, you know. Until she started competing with you. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Competing? You were the kind of woman she never thought she could be, Brenda said softly. So she tore you down instead. She looked away, her fingers twisting her purse strap. I raised her to be ambitious, but I forgot to teach her kindness. For the first time, Clara saw something she hadn't before defeat. The proud, sharp-tongued Brenda was gone. This was a mother grasping for anything that might save her child. Then Brenda took a trembling breath. There's one more thing, she said. Vanessa is pregnant. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Pregnant, Clara whispered. 3 months, Brenda said. She hasn't told the public. She's afraid it'll make things worse. But I thought you deserved to know. Clara sank slowly into the nearest chair. The air in the room seemed to change, thick, fragile. She stared out the window, her mind a whirl of memories: Marcus as a baby, the way Harold had held him, the lullabies she used to hum. A child, she murmured. Another child born into all this noise. Brenda's eyes glistened. That's why I'm here. For the baby's sake. Don't take more from them than what's already gone. Clara looked up, her voice quiet but firm. You think I enjoy any of this? I didn't want revenge, Brenda. I wanted peace. But peace costs something. Brenda nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know. I just had to try. She reached for her bag. She'll never forgive me for coming here, but I couldn't stand by again. Clara rose, her tone softening just slightly. For what it's worth, I don't hate you. You enabled her, but you also taught her to survive. Maybe she'll need that now. Brenda gave a weak smile. Maybe. She paused at the door. You're stronger than anyone I know, Clara. I hope you'll use that strength for Mercy this time. When she was gone, the silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, full of echoes. Clara sat down again, her tea long gone cold. A baby. A grandchild she might never meet. She pressed her palms together, eyes closed. What am I supposed to do with that? She whispered. That evening she called Langford. They're expecting a child, she said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end. Does that change anything? He asked. Legally, no. Emotionally, maybe. I don't want to ruin them, Langford, she said quietly. But I can't just let it go. Then don't, he said gently. Let the court handle it. You've earned the right to peace. Don't trade it for guilt. She thanked him and ended the call, but his words lingered. She spent the rest of the night pacing the kitchen, thinking about Marcus, about Harold, about what mercy meant when justice had already been served. When she finally sat down, she opened her old notebook. Under the line that read, Step 5, Forgive without forgetting, she added a new one. Step 6, Show mercy without surrender. Before bed, she went to her dresser and pulled out a faded photograph. Marcus at 5 years old, grinning with a popsicle dripping down his chin. She traced his face with her finger, then whispered, I hope your child never learns the way you did. The next morning the light was soft and golden. Clara brewed tea and opened the window wide. The world outside smelled of rain and honeysuckle. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, just a passing sound from another house, but it made her chest ache. She sat at her table, took a blank sheet of paper and began to write, not to Langford, not to Marcus or Vanessa, but to the unborn child. Dear little one, she wrote slowly. You don't know me and maybe you never will. But I hope you grow up in a world where love doesn't hurt, and where silence isn't mistaken for weakness. I hope you inherit your father's smile but not his blindness, your mother's ambition but not her cruelty. And if you ever hear my name, I hope they tell you the truth, that I wasn't angry, only tired of being invisible. When she finished, she folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope marked, For the Child. Then she placed it in her drawer beside the deed to her house. Outside, thunder murmured somewhere far away, but the air inside was still. Clara stood by the window watching the first drops of rain fall against the glass. Maybe mercy is its own kind of justice, she whispered. She closed the curtains and turned off the light, letting the sound of rain carry her to sleep. For the first time since the storm began, her dreams were gentle. The morning light spilled across the kitchen table, catching on the neat stacks of paper Clara had been sorting since dawn. The official notice from the court lay on top, judgment in her favor final and binding. Marcus and Vanessa were ordered to pay damages over 5 years. She stared at the document for a long moment, then folded it gently and slid it into a folder marked closure. Her tea sat untouched beside it, steam curling into the air. There was no triumph in her chest, only stillness. She turned to the window where sunlight lit the marigolds outside. "We did it, Harold," she whispered. "It's over." The house was quiet, but not the heavy quiet it used to be. It was a clean quiet, like a room, after spring cleaning, emptied of ghosts, full of air. Later that morning she walked to the local community center carrying a small envelope. Inside was her first donation from the settlement, $500. When she handed it to the director, a gray-haired woman named Lydia, the woman looked startled. "Mrs. Johnson, this is very generous." Clara smiled. "It's not generosity. It's gratitude. I got my life back because someone helped me understand my rights. I want other women to have the same chance." Lydia squeezed her hand. "You're a brave one." Clara shook her head. "No. I'm just one of many who finally got tired of being quiet." When she left the center, the air outside was soft and warm. A breeze lifted the edges of her scarf as she walked back home. On the corner, a young woman stopped her. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Johnson?" she asked shyly. "The lady from the videos," Clara nodded. The woman smiled nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you. My mother lives with me, and sometimes I forget she's getting older. Your story reminded me to listen better." Clara's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time, pride that didn't hurt. "Listening is a kind of love," she said gently. "Don't let her feel invisible." That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table and opened her notebook again. She flipped past the pages filled with steps and plans and stopped at a blank one. Slowly she began to write. Step 7. Turn pain into purpose. 2 weeks later, she returned to the community center, not as a donor but as a speaker. The director had convinced her to share her story at a support meeting for women over 50. The small auditorium smelled faintly of coffee and paper. About 30 women sat in folding chairs, their faces curious, some weary, some hopeful. When Clara stepped to the front, she felt her knees shake. For a moment, she thought she might not find the words. Then she looked at them, women with hands like hers, lined and strong, and everything came. "I spent 2 years being told I was a burden," she began. "And I believed it. Because sometimes love makes you deaf to disrespect. But then one day I realized I was still alive, and I decided that had to mean something." The room was silent. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Clara continued, voice steady. "Taking back my house didn't make me cruel, it made me free, and if my story means anything, let it be this: your peace is not negotiable, not for your children, not for anyone." When she finished, the women stood and clapped. One of them, tall with silver braids, walked up and hugged her tightly. "You said what I've wanted to say for years," she whispered. "Thank you for saying it out loud." Clara held her close, tears stinging her eyes. "You can say it too," she murmured. "It's never too late." The next morning, Clara found herself at her old desk with a new idea. She wrote the words across the top of a blank page: The Harold and Clara Foundation. Beneath it, she wrote, "Helping women over 50 reclaim their homes, their rights, and their dignity." Langford helped her draw up the paperwork. "You're serious about this?" he asked, smiling. "Dead serious," she replied. "I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure no one else faces it alone." Within months, the foundation took shape. The local paper ran an article, "From Victim to Advocate, Clara Johnson launches fund for women in need." Donations started small, 50 here, 100 there, but they grew. Every time someone contributed, Clara sent a handwritten thank you note. "Because gratitude," she told Lydia one day, "is the only wealth that multiplies when you give it away." One afternoon, she stayed late at the foundation office, sorting mail. Among the usual letters was one without a return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper and a Polaroid. The photo showed a young woman, Vanessa, standing in a small apartment holding a newborn baby. The handwriting beneath was unmistakable. "His name is Jordan. I thought you should know." Clara sat down slowly, her hands trembling. She studied the baby's tiny face, the soft fuzz of hair, the small fingers curled around a blanket. The note was unsigned, but she didn't need a name. For a long time she just stared at the picture, her eyes filling. "A boy," she whispered. "My grandson." That night she wrote a letter and sealed it in an envelope marked "For Jordan when he's old enough." Inside, she wrote, "You don't know me, but I've thought about you every day since I learned you existed. If you ever hear stories about me, know this: I loved your father once even when he forgot how to love back. And I hope you grow up to understand that strength can be gentle and truth can be quiet. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." She placed the letter in a small box in her dresser, alongside the old deed, Harold's wedding ring, and her notebook. Then, she sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. The hum of life below sounded soft and forgiving. Weeks passed and the foundation thrived. Clara spoke at more events, shared her story on podcasts, and mentored women who arrived at her door with trembling hands and tearful eyes. "You don't need permission to be free," she would tell them. "You just need proof you can survive the noise." One afternoon after a talk, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 30. "Mrs. Johnson," she said nervously, "I'm not like your story. I'm on the other side. I'm the one who made my mother-in-law feel small. And after hearing you speak, I realized how wrong I've been." Clara looked at her gently. "Then you're already better than who you were yesterday." The woman burst into tears. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go home," she said softly. "Start again. It's not too late to be kind." That night, as the house settled into silence, Clara poured herself a glass of wine. She stood by the window looking at the marigolds swaying under the porch light. "You'd laugh if you saw all this, Harold," she said. "Your quiet little wife turned into a crusader." She smiled. "But maybe this is what you meant when you said life doesn't end, it changes its job." Before bed, she opened her notebook one last time. Under Step 7, she added one final line. Step 8, leave the door open for healing. She closed it gently, set it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The room filled with soft darkness, peaceful and whole. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought of the baby in the photo, of the women she'd met, of the laughter that might one day fill these walls again. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of it. The past no longer chained her. The present no longer bruised her. And the future, quiet, uncertain, shining, felt like a gift she'd finally earned. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring when Clara sat on the park bench near the fountain, her gloved hands resting on her lap. The city hummed around her, gentle and alive, children, laughing, birds darting above the pond, the faint sound of a saxophone somewhere across the street. She checked her watch. 3 o'clock. Her chest tightened. After all these years, she hadn't expected this moment to come, and yet here she was, waiting to meet the one person who hadn't hurt her, who carried the bloodline she could still believe in. When she first saw them in the distance, her breath caught. Vanessa walked slowly across the park path, holding a boy's hand. The child was about 8 tall for his age, his skin, the warm bronze of summer, his hair, a thick halo of curls. He looked curious, not afraid. Vanessa, however, looked fragile. The once perfect posture, the sharp eyes, the steel in her expression, all gone. She stopped a few paces away, gave a tentative nod, and whispered something to the boy. Then she stepped back, letting him walk forward alone. He stopped in front of Clara, eyes wide. "You're Miriam?" he asked. His voice was soft but sure. "You can call me Grandma if you want," she said, smiling gently. "Grandma Miriam." He tilted his head, studying her face like he was memorizing it. "Mom said you wrote a book." "I did," Clara replied. "Did you read it, just some parts?" "The parts she let me," he said, kicking a pebble. "You were very brave." Clara laughed softly, the sound trembling. "I don't know about brave. I just stopped being afraid." They sat down on the bench together. The boy looked around the park, his hands fiddling with the zipper of his jacket. I like this place, he said. There's a pond with ducks. I used to bring your father to feed the ducks when he was your age, she said, her gaze softening at the memory. He used to chase them until he fell in. The boy laughed bright and unguarded. Mom says Dad was clumsy. He still is, Clara said. Vanessa watched from a distance, arms folded, expression unreadable. The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment Clara saw the woman she once might have been before bitterness turned her hard. Mom says you're really strong, the boy said suddenly. She said she wasn't very nice to you. Clara looked down at him, surprised by the honesty. She told you that? He nodded. She said she was wrong. That people can change. Clara's eyes misted. Your mom's learning something very important then. What, the boy asked. That kindness is stronger than pride. They spent the next hour walking through the park, talking about simple things, his favorite book, his school projects, the dog he wanted but couldn't have yet. When he laughed, something in her chest loosened. It was the sound of new beginnings, of something blooming after too long a winter. When it was time to leave, he turned to her and said, "Can I see you again?" Clara looked at Vanessa, who nodded silently. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that very much." He threw his small arms around her waist. "I like you, Grandma Miriam." Her throat tightened. "I like you too, sweetheart." As they walked away, Vanessa paused, turned back, and met Clara's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Vanessa whispered, "Thank you for giving him a chance to know you." Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you for letting him." When they were gone, Clara sat back down on the bench. The world felt brighter, fuller. The laughter of children nearby mingled with the splash of the fountain. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "That's enough. That's all I ever needed." That evening, Clara returned home, the house bathed in warm golden light. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and opened her notebook. On the last page she wrote, "Step 9, forgive without reopening old wounds." She closed the notebook gently and set it beside her on the table. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the candle she'd lit. Outside, the marigolds she'd planted years ago were beginning to bloom again. She could almost hear Harold's voice teasing her, "You always plant them too early." She smiled. "They never let me down," she murmured. Later that night, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Vanessa. "Marquis hasn't stopped talking about you. He wants to show you his drawings next time." Clara stared at the words for a long moment before replying. "I'd love to see them. Thank you, Vanessa. Truly." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then came back again. "You were right, Miriam. Peace costs something. But it's worth it." Clara placed the phone down, a soft smile on her lips. She looked around her living room, the walls lined with framed photos of her foundation's events. The laughter frozen in the smiles of the women she'd helped. The newest picture was from the grand opening of the second shelter, the Miriam Dubois Center for Dignity. Underneath it was a plaque that read, "For every woman who refused to disappear." The next morning, Clara attended another meeting at the foundation. The small conference room was alive with chatter and energy. Lydia, the director, beamed. "We just helped our 200th woman this year. You've changed more lives than you realize." Clara waved her hand modestly. "I didn't change them. They changed themselves. I just opened a door." During the lunch break, a woman approached her mid-60s, dressed neatly, hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "Mrs. Dubois, my daughter treats me, well, not kindly. But I'm afraid of being alone. I don't think I'm as strong as you." Clara took her hands gently. "The loneliness you fear is less painful than the company that destroys you," she said softly. "And when you choose yourself, you'll realize you were never truly alone." The woman began to cry, and Clara held her steady and calm. Around them, the noise of the room faded, leaving only that moment, a transfer of strength, a reminder that survival could be beautiful too. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city glowed in shades of amber and violet, Clara returned home and sat on her balcony. She looked out over the skyline, her heart light, her spirit unburdened. She thought of Marcus, somewhere far away, perhaps rebuilding, perhaps learning. She thought of Vanessa, humbled but human again. And she thought of little Marquis, with his big eyes and soft smile, a bridge she never thought she'd cross again. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of blooming marigolds. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I'm at peace." Moments later, she turned on the lamp and began writing a short note for her foundation's next newsletter. To every woman reading this, you are not what they called you. You are what you decide to become. Family is not defined by blood, it's defined by love, respect, and boundaries. And peace is not something given. It's something reclaimed. She signed it with love and respect, Miriam Dubois. When she finished, she leaned back, listening to the quiet hum of the night. Then she smiled, knowing that her story had found its ending not in revenge or grief, but in the simple, steady heartbeat of peace. And as her final thought drifted into the air, she whispered to herself, "If you liked my story, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and remember to subscribe for more stories about courage, family, and justice. I'll be here sharing them one truth at a time." The screen faded to the soft image of her marigolds in bloom golden against the twilight, as her voice lingered warm, steady, and free.